Had to borrow that money in the marketplace, interest rates would go up, and this would all come to an end. So the Federal Reserve provides the incentive for Congress to spend money. Some like to spend money on runaway spending overseas and militarism. The others like to spend it on welfare, and they sort of get along, and then the Fed prints the money. But it's coming to an end, but exactly when that's going to occur, we don't know. But we are truly an insolvent nation, because if we had to pay all our bills today, it'd be impossible. A tweet from Wild and Wonderful: if the Fed did not control our monetary policy, it would be in the hands of Congress. Yeah, that's so much more comforting. That's the tweet. But that's an incorrect statement, because when we were under gold standard, the Congress had a responsibility of guaranteeing that the dollar was as good as gold and that the dollar was a stable currency. So no, you don't have to have Congress. You don't want Congress to do it. I wouldn't think Congress might print even more than the Federal Reserve, but they'd bail out different people. They might bail out the mortgage holder and the farmers, where the Fed bails out the big banks and the big corporations and foreign banks and foreign corporations. So it's whose special benefits. So I don't want the Fed to bail out the very super wealthy, and I don't want Congress, to say that we can just print out money and bail out, every mortgage holder. What you want is the market to operate where the interest rates go up by the market, supply money comes into the marketplace, and if people go bankrupt, nobody bails them out. And they just have to write those debt off, and you wouldn't get these huge financial bubbles like the housing bubble and the NASDAQ bubble. That's all a creature of the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. Gary in Butler, Pennsylvania, independent line, welcome.
Yeah, Mr. Paul, it's just it's a shame that you get your rightful media coverage.
All right, but Jesse, I'm going to hop off and speak. I'll see if it's going to speed up my internet so I can get these two uploaded in less than an hour and a half.
Rio plus 20. It was in Rio in June, I think, and it talked about an inclusive green economy, and it affects every aspect of our lives as a big country, our lifestyles, behaviors, education, health, consumption, production, agriculture, and it wants to create a international monetary fund. Might be according to a document, efforts need to be made to explore the potential for innovative size of an IMF potential world currency known as special drawing rights, SDR.
Let's get a response, Gary.
I think his concerns are justified, because I think those who manage the world financial system and those who manage our dollar, both nationally and internationally, know exactly what I'm saying, that this is destined to fail. So they're sitting around trying to make plans on what it should be replaced with. And I think they're absolutely right. They want to replace it with an international currency. They'd like to use the IMF. They're interested in world government. I'm interested in not even belonging into the United Nations. I don't want to give up our national sovereignty in any way, and I certainly don't want them to have the currency. So this is the plan that they have, and I don't want our country going to war under UN resolutions or NATO resolutions. I believe in national sovereignty. I believe in our Constitution, and that if we want to influence the world, we should do it by setting a good example, but not allowing international governments, international banks like the IMF do the job that we in the Congress should be doing.
Congressman Ron Paul, Republican of Texas, representing the 14th District. That includes Galveston, Lake Jackson, Victoria, and Freeport, serving his 12th term, also a presidential candidate. Let's go to R.I., a Democratic caller in Blytheville, Arkansas. Hi. R.I., you're on the air. Turn down your TV.
How you doing?
Good. Go ahead. You're on with Congressman Paul.
Yes, I thank y'all for what all y'all do for C-SPAN.
Thanks. Please go ahead. All right, we're waiting for you.
I just want to ask Congress Paul.
Yes. All right, state.
Why not Mitt Romney release his tax records?
Okay. Mitt Romney's tax
Well, I've
records.
made a statement on that, and I think the American people would like to see that happen, and I haven't volunteered to instruct him what he should do. I try to instruct myself what to do. But I think the American people have asked for it, and I've made a statement that it would probably be helpful to him you know, to let the people know if that's what they want, since he's, you know, the likely nominee for the Republican Party.
Have you spoken with Mitt Romney?
I have off
recently?
and on over the many months. I've saw him a good bit during the campaign. So
Have you talked to him about endorsing him?
Not directly with him.
And do you have a plan for that you're willing to share with us?
No, I have no plan. We still have a convention to go to.
Well, tell us about the convention. We're getting some questions on our Facebook page asking what you're going to be doing in Tampa. Mark asks, will you be speaking at the convention? Whom will you invite to speak if you were scheduling the convention?
Well, I am scheduling a rally before the convention, and that'll be on Sunday. I'll be speaking at that rally. I had to have my own in order to speak. Now, I have not been invited to speak at the National Convention. It doesn't mean I absolutely won't be speaking at the National Convention, but as of now, I have not been invited to speak there.
And who would you like to hear from if Mark had his way and you got to pick the roster of speakers? Who are leaders in the Republican Party you'd like to hear from?
Well, unfortunately, I end up picking a lot of individuals who are probably more academically inclined than politically inclined. But, you know, in our rally that we're having people around the country who have been successful during our campaign, who have become state chairmen, who have become nominees for Senate races that have great potential, and some are in office already. So there's quite a few. It's usually those who have been successful with the same message that I've been talking about, those individuals who believe in personal liberty, a different foreign policy, an understanding of the Federal Reserve, and a market economy. And we put this all together, and there's quite a few. And with the risk of missing somebody, I'll just say there's quite a few, and they can look up the list of people who will be coming to our meeting on the 26th of August.
Here's how a story from USA Today describes the status of your campaign. It says you're no longer actively campaigning for president, but you've not officially suspended your bid. You're still in the running to that degree. Here's the latest GOP convention delegate count that we see from the Associated Press. With Mitt Romney, 1,522 delegates. Congressman Ron Paul, 158. Will you share any more with us about what your plan is at the convention in terms of releasing delegates or sharing your message of what you'd like to see at Tampa come out of the Republican Party?
Well, I look at this a little differently. It's not like I own my delegates. I'm not going to tell them what to do at all. But I would, at the convention, we'll probably clarify the numbers, because the way we count up all our delegates and all our alternates and people who are there that might not be able to vote for me on the first go-around, it's closer to 500. So that's a significant amount of a number of people who will be participating in the process and participating in the platform. So we'll just do what we can to promote what we believe in and what we think Republicans have said they believed in, because for years and years they've argued they believe in limited government, and the group of people that will be attending the Paul conference and our delegates, believe me, they're not looking for bigger government. This country doesn't need bigger government, and Republicans profess that they want less government, but we actually believe in it. We don't want to just cut on the proposed increases, and that's all that's happened for the last 30 or 40 years. Nobody who's in office, it's always tinkering around the edges. We want to change the philosophy of this government. It's the philosophy of liberty. It's the philosophy of the Constitution, and defending everybody's individual rights.
Congressman Ron Paul. Let's hear from Richard, who's a Republican in Corrigan, Indiana. Good morning, Richard.
Yes, good morning. Two questions. First, this was all intended for the previous speaker, but I got put on hold till now. First is campaign finance, and the other is morality in campaigning. I want to ask, why is it the cost, the huge cost of the media, the press, put into this equation on campaign financing? I'm not talking about news. I'm talking about political analysis of the news. The amount of money contributed by Fox News and the liberal media to this whole campaign business is millions of dollars. That isn't figured into this equation. and it ought to be.
Okay, let's get a response from Congressman Paul, who's nodding his head.
I think he has a great point, because some people look at this very superficially and they say, why is there so much money, all these donations and all this lobbying effort, millions and millions of dollars? Well, that's because government is too big and the politicians are yielding to the temptation of being influenced by money. But then they come along and they say, well, there's too much money and too many special interests, so therefore we have to write another law and say people can't do that. But his point is, okay, let's say corporations and individuals can't spend a penny. Well, it would go underground. They would spend it one way or the other. But the whole thing is that let's say you take all the corporations out of the money and all the private money out, then you still have the media. Then you have the left wing and the right wing on their news and their corporations. Why should they have a free ride on this? And so I would say that you don't solve the problem by more regulations telling people how to spend their money. You do it by shrinking the size of government. So there's no incentive to go to the auction. That's what government is a big auction, auctioning off all the benefits and all the privileges. And unless you have purity of thought of everybody in Washington, believe me, that problem is going to exist. The answer is going to be the shrinking of government, but just to regulate private financing and then allowing the corporations who run all the TV companies, then they would have free reign.
Preston joins us from New York, on our Independence line. Good morning, Preston.
Good morning, Libby. How are you doing?
Good. Go on right ahead with Congressman Paul.
Hi, Congressman Paul. I want to echo the spirit of that earlier tweet that you had, and I agree with Richard to some extent. Here's what I don't get, Congressman Paul. You want congressional oversight of the Fed, right?
That is correct.
Okay,
Congress,
sir, Congress is broken. What are you thinking? It's so locked up by politics that it's almost completely dysfunctional. I don't get it. I'll tell you what, I will accept that Congress can have oversight of the Fed when
right.
Congress can get its act together. The first thing Congress should be concentrating on is on something like more realistic, like lobbying reform or campaign finance reform. That's far more realistic and doable even in this ridiculous environment we have now. I think it's more important. Why don't you, try something radical by, like, working with Jack Abramoff or something. Team up with that guy who seems to have really turned his life around and is really focused on lobbying, and nobody knows it better than he does. Why don't you take the lead on something like this? You're just not going to get this oversight of the Fed through, sir.
Oh, well, I think you're finding an excuse to duck the issue. Yes, I think Congress does have a lot of shortcomings, but if you're going to straighten out Congress, just straighten them up and have them do their responsibility. Matter of fact, the GAO is one of the few agencies of government that has a half-decent reputation. So I would say that's your best goal. I mean, you don't have the members of Congress actually doing it. What you have is a GAO doing an audit and giving this information. So just to say because Congress is inept, sure, they've been inept for 100 years on monetary policy. That doesn't mean we should say, oh, we can't do it. We'll just let them go ahead and do this. No, for forever and ever. So yes, they do have shortcomings, but I believe that you don't just renege on your responsibility because you can't get good results.
David, Democrats line, Birmingham, Alabama. Good morning.
Well, good morning. Mr. Paul, I find you rather disingenuous. You draw Social Security, but you're against Social Security programs. Also, you are against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But another thing I would like to say, what you were saying, I found out that you also have a lot of money invested in gold. So basically what you people are doing, you are looking out for your own interests. The United States is not bankrupt. It can print money anytime it wants to. It's different from Greece and the Eurozone. The Eurozone is invested. Also, the price of gold has nothing to do with the dollar. The dollar is based on oil, the price of a barrel of oil, which is being manipulated by China because China has previously has contracts where it has a fixed price on a barrel of oil, such as $20. When the price rises, it stays at that price. This is the difference. Thank you.
What is his question?
So, right, the Civil Rights Act.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no.
On this vote, the yeas are 238, the nays are 177. The previous question is ordered. House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Speaker, if I could ask for unanimous consent to speak out of order for 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand here with a lot of sadness with my friends from the Colorado delegation. Democrats and Republicans were a pretty tight-knit group. We had a terrible incident in Aurora, Colorado on Friday. You all are well aware of it. 12 people were killed, 58 were wounded, and it is with sadness and grief that we come before you today. As our governor said at the vigil on Sunday night, we will remember these 12 and those who were shot. But there was a silver lining in this very, very dark moment in the history of Colorado. And we saw bravery and selflessness and heroism among the people that were in that theater that night. And any one of us can tell you stories of how people, to complete strangers, were willing to give up their own lives to save the life of the stranger next to them. And you know, in times when it is difficult like that, you want to find bright spots, and there were many. Another bright spot was the courage demonstrated by the Aurora Police and the Fire Department and the FBI and the ATF in the face of what was a monstrous action by this guy. In Colorado, we consider ourselves to be pretty tough. Aurorans, where this act took place, pretty tough. It hurts. We all hurt. But we're resilient, and we will get through it. And the stories that some of those who are injured are sharing actually really do lighten the day. And I know any one of us would be happy to talk to you all about that. But there has been a tremendous outpouring of sympathy and condolences and compassion from all of you. And I know I speak on behalf of our entire delegation to thank you for thinking about us and where we live in our community, because we are in this together, and we just thank you very much. So I ask that all of you stand with me and our delegation in a moment of silence to honor the memory of those that were killed, the wounded victims, and all Americans during this time of healing. And as I said once before, and as our governor said, we will remember these people who were hurt, and we will help them all along the way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. From Florida.
Recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
The House moves on to the rule vote for two bills. One bill would replace the current Interior Department offshore oil drilling plan, increase the drilling leases from 15 to 29. That bill will get an hour of general debate and 8 amendments to be considered if the rule is approved. That rule also includes consideration of a bill reducing federal regulations. That bill likely will be debated later in the week. Later today, the House will also debate Congressman Ron Paul's bill calling for an audit of the Federal Reserve. Congressional Budget Office has done a bit of an audit on the health care law. Congressional Quarterly reporting this afternoon that the CBO says the cost to the government will be reduced by $84 billion in light of the Supreme Court decision last month to mostly uphold the law. The Congressional Budget Office reported today, along with the Joint Committee on Taxation, that the health law will have a net cost of $1.168 billion from 2012 through 2022, compared with the $1.252 billion estimate before the court decision. That's from the CBO. The Senate is in today. They continue consideration of both a Democratic and Republican proposal dealing with the expiring 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. We expect some procedural action on that tomorrow in the Senate. You can follow the Senate on C-SPAN 2.
Vote, the yeas are 244, the nays are 170. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. House will be in order. You got Michigan on here. That's ISA. Thank you. Would members clear the aisles, clear the well, take your conversations off the floor so that the House can be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 459 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 441, H.R. 459, a bill to require a full audit of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Banks by the Comptroller General of the United States before the end of 2012 and for other purposes.
Gentleman is correct. Once again, would members kindly clear the aisles and the well? Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 459, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, directs the GAO to conduct a full audit of the Federal Reserve. The Dodd-Frank legislation mandated a GAO audit of the Fed, but that audit issued by the General Accountability Office in July of 2011 focused solely on the issues concerning emergency credit facility. GAO remains restricted under the current law from conducting a broader audit of the Fed that includes, for instance, a review of the Fed's monetary policy operations and its agreements with foreign governments and central banks. The bill remedies this statutory permitting GAO the investigative arm of Congress, to conduct a nonpartisan audit that will review all of these transactions. The findings of the audit are to be reported to Congress. In particular, it is appropriate that we consider this legislation at this time. While Congress should not manage or micromanage details of monetary policy, it needs to be able to conduct oversight of the Fed. The Fed was created by Congress to be the central bank, independent of the influence of the U.S. Treasury. It has never and was never intended to, in fact, be independent of Congress or independent of the American people. In recent years, the Fed's extraordinary interventions into the economies, fiscal markets, have led some to call into question its independence. We do not ask for an audit for that reason. We ask for an audit because the American people ultimately must be able to hold the Fed accountable, and to do so, they must know, at least in retrospect, what the Fed has done over these many years that it has been without an audit. That is why I support H.R. 459, a bipartisan bill with mine and 273 other co-sponsors. I urge my colleagues' support, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Members are reminded not to traffic the well while another member is under recognition. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, when the sponsors of the bill talk about auditing the Federal Reserve, they don't mean a traditional audit. An outside independent accounting firm already audits the Federal Reserve's annual financial statements. And GAO already is empowered to review the Fed's financial statements and a broad range of its functions. In fact, the Wall Street reform legislation Democrats passed last Congress expanded the types of audits GAO can conduct, as has been mentioned by Mr. Issa. So there is transparency and accountability when it comes to the Federal Reserve's finances and operations. However, this bill would instead jeopardize the Fed's independence by subjecting its decisions on interest rates and monetary policy to GAO audit. The Fed, like every other major central bank in the world, is independent. And Congress has rightly insulated the Fed from short-term political pressures. I agree with the Chairman Bernanke that congressional review of the Fed's monetary policy decisions would be a, quote, nightmare scenario, especially judging by the track record of this Congress when it comes to governing effectively and intervening in the courts and other areas. We don't have to look any further than the Congress's unnecessarily taking the country to the brink of default last summer in a display of politics. All of us, Mr. Speaker, want transparency. All of us here want to make sure that the Federal Reserve is working to carry out the economic goals of the American people, which are maximum employment and price stability. But that's not what this bill is about. This bill increases the likelihood that the Fed will make decisions based on political rather than economic considerations. And that is not a recipe for sound monetary policy. I urge my colleagues to defeat this bill and preserve the independence of the Fed so it can keep our currency stable and cultivate the best conditions for our economy to grow and create jobs. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, we in Congress have shown too frequently our inability in a political environment to make tough choices. That failure has led us in part to where we are today. I urge my colleagues to defeat this unwarranted, unjustified, and dangerous legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, it's now my honor to yield time to the author of this bill, the gentleman from Texas, the man who understands that not knowing should never be an answer, Mr. Paul.
Woo-hoo! Texas
2 minutes.
Is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise, obviously, in strong support of this legislation. I don't know how anybody could be against transparency and they want secrecy, especially when the secrecy is to protect individuals who deal in trillions of dollars, much bigger than what the Congress does. And these trillions of dollars bail out all the wealthy, rich people, the banks and the big corporations, international, overseas banks, bailing out Europe, dealing with central banks around Europe and different places. And to say that we should have secrecy and say that it's political to have transparency, well, it's very political when you have a Federal Reserve that can bail out one company and not another company. That's pretty political. I think when people talk about independence and having this privacy of the central bank, it means they want secrecy. And secrecy is not good. We should have privacy for the individual, but we should have openness of government all the time. And we've drifted a long way from that. The bill essentially removes the prohibitions against a full audit. To audit, we should know what kind of transactions are. We should know about the deals that they made when they were fixing the price of LIBOR. These are the kind of things that have gone on for years and we have no access to. So Congress has this responsibility. We're reneging on our responsibility. We have the responsibility and we have not done it. So it is up to us to reassert ourselves. The Constitution is very clear who has the responsibility, but the law conflicts with the Constitution. The law comes along and says the Congress can't do it. Well, you can't change the Constitution, prohibit the Congress from finding out what's going on by writing a law. And this is what has happened. So it is time that we repeal this prohibition against the full audit of the Federal Reserve. We deserve it. The American people deserve it. The American people know about it and understand it, and that's what they're asking for. They're sick and tired of what happened in the bailout and where the wealthy got bailed out and the poor lost their jobs and they lost their homes. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
I yield 4 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, Mr. Frank.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this is a bad idea, and I'm somewhat confused. By the way, we will be debating tomorrow a bill which restricts rulemaking, and it exempts the Federal Reserve as I read it. So we're kind of on again, off again about the Federal Reserve. It seems to me what we're talking about is taking some fake punches at the Federal Reserve, but not doing anything serious. My Republican colleagues brought up a reconciliation bill that was going to subject the Consumer Bureau to appropriations. So I offered an amendment to subject the Federal Reserve to appropriations. That was voted down. So we're not going to restrict their rulemaking. We're not going to subject them to appropriations, even though that's being done elsewhere. We're going to audit them, which is a way to look tough without really being tough. Did the gentleman want me to yield?
I would.
I'll yield.
I thank the gentleman. Would you suggest that we should do both of those? And then
no, I will take back my time and say we should do none of them. I was saying that I have a consistent position. I don't think we should do any of them. What I'm saying is people who get up there and beat their chest about how tough they are and they're not afraid of the Federal Reserve, but exempted from their great rulemaking bill and subject the Consumer Bureau, that terrible threat to the well-being of Americans, to the appropriations process, but let the Federal Reserve, which spends about 150 times as much, go free. I am inclined to doubt their seriousness. Not their purity, that would be a violation of the rules, but their seriousness. This is a way to shake your fist at that big bad Fed, and it's not a good way. We hear a lot about uncertainty. Remember, the Federal Reserve is now subject to a complete openness about all of its transactions with private companies. We did that last year. The gentleman from Texas had a major role in that. When the Federal Reserve deals with any other institution, we know what it does. We don't know it necessarily the same day. There were these predictions about what terrible things were going to happen when the Federal Reserve did this and that. They haven't come true. Maybe they will someday, but we will know it. This makes this exception. It says that we will audit the decisions about monetary policy. It says that members who vote on what the interest rate should be will now be audited. They will be subject to being quizzed about why they did that. Now, I will tell my Democratic friends, understand that one part of this problem is the objection on the part of the Republican Party to the fact that our Federal Reserve, unusual among central banks, has a dual mandate. They are charged under our statute to be concerned about inflation and about unemployment. Now, the Republicans have an agenda they're keeping on low key until next year. They got a bill, but they won't act on it yet. But they would like to strip that part of the mandate. They would like the Federal Reserve to be only involved in inflation. They don't like the notion that the Federal Reserve deals with unemployment. And this is a way that if it were ever to become law, no one thinks it is. This is look how tough we are. We're going to wave our fists at the Fed. But it would be a way to kind of put pressure on members of the Open Market Committee and see, well, were you worried about unemployment when you did this? That's the audit. This has nothing to do with how they spend their money. It has nothing to do with whom they contract. That's what people usually think about audit. It doesn't have anything to do with the way in which they are, whether they're efficient or not. It's an ideological agenda by a group of people who didn't like what the Federal Reserve was doing, under, by the way, George Bush. There was reference to the bailouts, which were, of course, under the Bush administration. One of the things we did, by the way, in our bill 2 years ago, all my Republican colleagues voted against the bill, was to take away from the Federal Reserve the power they used under President Bush to lend $85 billion to AIG. We rescinded that. I don't think Mr. Bernanke, a Bush appointee, was doing the wrong thing necessarily, but we took back that power. So this is partly a show, because on the two serious efforts to curtail the Fed's powers, my Republican colleagues aren't there. But secondly, and as I said, I'm consistent. I don't think we should do any of these things. I think what we did with regard to openness makes sense. I'm not pretending to be tough when I'm not.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
But what it will do is destabilize. We have worries about expectations. There is a fear that we will be too inflationary or that we won't grow enough. People on Wall Street are not as sophisticated as some people think. They're not even sophisticated about their own business, as we know. But they will read this and take it more seriously than the members here do, who think it might eventually become law. And it will destabilize some of the financial system. They will see it as political interference, not with the contracting procedures, not with the budget, not with how many cars they have, but with how they decide on interest rates. And the perception that the Congress is going to politicize the way in which interest rates are set will in itself have a destabilizing effect. And as I said, nobody here thinks it's ever going to become law, but there is this fear on the part of others who don't know that will translate into precisely the kind of uncertainty, precisely the kind of unsettling on investments that my Republican colleagues pretend to fear, and it will also send them the message, stop worrying about unemployment.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
As I introduce my good friend and leader on this issue, Mr. Chaffetz, I might note that when the word Republican and Democrat are used in this hall, hopefully when there's 45 Democratic members on this bill as co-sponsors, we'd recognize this as a bipartisan bill. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Utah.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank the chairman. I also I want to appreciate and congratulate Dr. Ron Paul for his tireless pursuit of this openness and transparency. Without his leadership, we wouldn't be at this point today, and I applaud him and thank him for that. Some would say that the audit, that the Fed is already audited, but there are some key points where it is not. These include transactions with foreign central banks, discussion and actions on monetary policy, and transactions made under the direction of the Federal Open Market Committee. If we're truly about openness and transparency in this nation, which distinguishes us above and beyond so many others, we deserve and need to know this information. We need to also understand the imperative that is before us, because the Federal Reserve balance sheet has exploded in recent years. In fact, since 2008, it has literally tripled, gone from $908 billion on its balance sheet to over $2.8 trillion, nearly a 33% annualized increase since January of 2008. The Federal Reserve ownership of treasuries has also increased substantially in recent years, having more than doubled from January of 2008 to January of 2012, where it went from $741 billion to $1.66 trillion. Let's understand also that in fiscal year 2011, the Federal Reserve purchased 76% of new treasuries. Certainly, the American people and this Congress deserves more openness, transparency, and at the very least an audit. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this common sense piece of legislation, and again, congratulate Dr. Paul and continue hope for his pursuit of this issue. Yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
I yield Ms. Maloney 2 minutes.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
This is an absolute terrible idea. Although I am in total agreement with Mr. Paul that transparency is a virtue, I also believe that the Federal Reserve must be free of any political influence. And I'm afraid that this bill opens the door for precisely that to happen. And I don't believe that there is anyone in this chamber that thinks that what the process needs is more politics. Make no mistake, I agree that maximum transparency is necessary and desirable. And that is precisely why we included numerous transparency requirements in the financial reform bill, as well as numerous audit requirements. We authorized the GAO to audit the Fed's emergency lending facility. We authorized the GAO to audit any special facility created within the Fed. And we required the Fed to issue an assessment 2 years after institutions were granted access to the Fed's discount window. We crafted those measures and more in a way that ensures transparency, but still preserves the independence of the Federal Reserve in its decision-making process in the critical area of monetary policy. But this bill, as it now stands, would provide information without a proper context, and that could have unintended consequences and have totally unwarranted effects on consumer confidence in our financial institutions. If the individual members of the Open Markets Committee know that each one of their decisions are subject to potential political pressure, it would significantly alter that decision-making process. An open door to the Federal Open Markets Committee would invite political pressures, and having decisions that are driven by politics and polling data is not the path to sound monetary policy. Decisions about monetary policy should never be based on the raw political needs of the moment, but instead should always be based strictly on objective economic considerations and guided by the twin mandates of low inflation and full employment. The unintended consequences of this bill would be to open the Federal Reserve to political influence, and that would have a negative impact on the Fed's independence and its ability to produce sound economic policy. I urge a strong bipartisan no vote. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
It's now my honor to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farrell.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the Constitution grants us the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, and we've delegated this to the Fed. Unfortunately, we've tied our hands behind our back with respect to seeing what they're doing, and it's our duty to conduct oversight. A moment ago, Mr. Frank said the audit was just fist pounding and chest pounding. I disagree. It's the first step. It's us doing our homework to determine what needs to be done to reform the Fed. Chairman Bernanke said this bill would be a nightmare scenario of political meddling in monetary affairs. I disagree. I think the current situation is a nightmare scenario in unaccountable government. As Justice Brandeis said, sunshine is always the best disinfectant. As a member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, we demand transparency from agencies like the GSA, the TSA, and other Fed agencies. I join my friend and neighbor in Congress, Dr. Paul, in demanding for the American people that sunshine be shined into the Fed and this audit be conducted. I urge my colleagues to support this bill because the American people have a right to know.
Gentleman from Maryland.
I grant the gentleman from Massachusetts 1 minute, Mr. Frank.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, to illustrate the misconceptions about this bill, let's refer to what the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, had to say. He said 76% of the purchases are this and that. Well, if this was so non-transparent, I don't know how we know that. He didn't have a subpoena. But the fact is, yes, he knows that because of the transparency we've already built in, but all the more important, the details, the specifics of every one of those transactions is already public. This isn't about those transactions and about with whom they were done and under what time period. It's about the motives of the people setting monetary policy. And let me address the Constitution. Yes, it is true that the Constitution gives us the power to do this. The Constitution gives us a lot of power. It gives us power to declare war on Canada. It gives us the power to do a lot of things. Wise people pick and choose which powers they use. But this is not about getting more information about their transactions. All of that is out there. This is an effort to give politicians, a wonderful group of people, of which I am one, more direct involvement in the actual decisions on setting of interest rates than is good for the economy.
Gentleman from California.
I now my honor to recognize for 1 minute the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
I'd like to thank Chairman Issa and thank and congratulate Dr. Ron Paul for his tireless work on this issue for many decades. Mr. Speaker, what is the Federal Reserve? I think even many members of this body couldn't answer that question. Yet Congress has delegated its constitutional authority to this committee of bankers and presidential appointees. To no institution in our country's history has Congress given so much power while knowing so little. As our central bank, we've entrusted the Federal Reserve with managing inflation. That means the Fed can change the value of Americans' life savings, their retirement accounts, and their mortgages. Lately, the Fed has taken on the role of, quote, lender of last resort. It has made unprecedented market interventions, promising billions of dollars to the country's largest financial institutions. When investors wouldn't buy mortgages, the Fed did. When creditors became wary of Congress's spending binge, the Fed stepped in. Years ago, Congress enacted an audit statute, but it prevents an audit of monetary policy. The government's accountants understandably were outraged, saying they couldn't, quote, satisfactorily audit the Federal Reserve System without authority to examine the Fed's largest assets. Congress should be wary of all types of central planning. We should be especially vigilant against unaccountable groups that profoundly affect Americans' lives and liberty. Pass this bill and let's audit the Fed. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Yield the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Watt, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me say first that this bill is not about sunshine. It's not about transparency. It is about dissatisfaction that some individuals have with the mandate that Congress has given to the Federal Reserve. The gentleman who just spoke is absolutely right. They're supposed to deal with inflation. That's what we told them to do in their mandate. They're supposed to deal with unemployment. That's what we told them to do in the mandate we gave them. And some people over there are dissatisfied with the fact that they don't want them to deal with unemployment. They don't want them to try to adjust and make changes that will be beneficial to our economy. And if they don't want that, they ought to just introduce a bill that repeals the mandate that we gave to them. Don't come and say we're talking about sunshine and transparency. Every time I turn on the television now, I hear the Federal Reserve, Chairman Bernanke, and members of the Federal Reserve talking about how the economy is going. That is not lack of sunshine and lack of information. I thought we had dealt with this when I was the ranking member of the subcommittee and Mr. Paul was the chairman, or I was the chairman and he was the ranking member. Mr. Paul's problem is he doesn't like the Federal Reserve. He's avowedly in favor of doing away with the Federal Reserve. And that's an honest position, but don't come in and try to cloak it in the guise of this agency is not transparent or it likes sunshine. If you don't like the mandate that they have, then have the guts to stand up and introduce a bill that says we are doing away with the Federal Reserve. And if you...
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 1 minute.
If you think we're in trouble now, you get the politics and the Congress involved in transactions with foreign governments and decisions about how we get ourselves out of this unemployment situation. If we had some answers about how to get out of unemployment, I would assume we would come forward with them, and nobody on this floor, this Congress, has done nothing to take up an unemployment bill. So I'm glad we have the Federal Reserve over there at least trying to figure out how to make some adjustments in our economy that will deal with unemployment.
And the last thing I want is for this Congress to be second-guessing, or an auditor that is not elected by anybody to be second-guessing the decisions of the people who are on the Federal Reserve. An auditor might be a good accountant. He can count, but I want somebody on the Federal Reserve, and hopefully it would be nice to have some people in Congress who could make some decisions about how to deal with unemployment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, the rules of the House prohibit going after someone's motivation, and I'm very concerned that a bill that in its substantially similar form was placed into Dodd-Frank by then Chairman Barney Frank is now being characterized as somehow ill-intended mischievous activity by the proponents. I would trust that that's not the intent of the speakers on behalf of that side of the aisle about this bipartisan bill that is virtually identical to the language that Barney Frank put into Dodd-Frank. I yield.
I just want to be clear that Mr. Frank and I both voted against the bill that you're talking about. So don't try to make it sound like it's me and Mr. Frank's bill. We voted against the bill. This is Ron Paul's bill, and we thought it was a terrible idea then, and we think it's a terrible idea now.
Reclaiming my time, I'd like to yield 15 seconds to the gentleman from Texas, the author of the bill.
Question then would be, did you vote against Dodd-Frank? Because it was in Dodd-Frank, it wasn't a separate bill. Maybe on a separate vote you might have done it, but it was in Dodd-Frank.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Montana for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Montana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Issa, and especially thank you, Dr. Paul. Tomorrow, the House of Representatives will uphold our constitutional duty and vote to pull back the secretive curtain of the Federal Reserve. The American people have a right to know. It's an important step in openness and government transparency that's long overdue. Just a few years ago, the Senate rejected an effort to add this strong audit language to the Dodd-Frank bill, but times are changing. Our economy struggles and job creation lags. It's more important than ever to look under the hood of the Federal Reserve. We need to find out exactly what they are doing and why. That way we can determine if the Fed is actually hurting our economy and discouraging job growth. In a democracy, no government body should be allowed to hide behind a curtain of secrecy. That's why I strongly stand behind this legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Pursuant to the chair's announcement of earlier today, the House will now observe a moment of silence in memory of Officer Jacob J. Chestnut and Detective John M. Gibson. Will all present please rise in observance of a moment of silence. Without objection, debate continues on H.R. 459. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts 30 seconds.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the Committee on Government Oversight isn't the official House historian. In fact, there was a motion to include language like this offered to the Financial Reform Bill. I voted no, as did Mr. Watt. It was included in the bill. It's true I voted for the bill. Of course, the gentleman from Texas voted against the bill. So if your vote on the whole bill is taken as an account of what you feel, he was against it. But when it went to conference, it was not in the Senate bill, which was the text of the conference, so it did not come up, and no Republican conferee offered it as an amendment. That is, in the conference, that language, which I and the gentleman from North Carolina voted against, was not offered by any member of the conference, Democrat or Republican.
Expired. Gentleman from California.
History records that Democrats broadly voted for it when it was voted out of this body. Nothing more need be said. With that, I recognize the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, for 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman from California for the time, and I want to commend the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, for his excellent work on this issue. Recently, I had a constituent say to me in a town hall meeting they thought it was time for Congress to start putting some mandates on the federal government. They're tired of government mandates on them. Why don't we mandate? Why don't we hold them accountable? This is a piece of legislation that does exactly that. It requires the GAO to conduct a full audit of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and of the Federal Reserve banks by the Comptroller General before the end of the year. That is significant. A timeline to do a job, to be held accountable to the people of this great nation for how they spend their time, their money, the decisions they make that affect us. It is imperative that we get this economy back on track. The actions that we will vote on today are part of that. Having a Federal Reserve that is accountable to our constituents, accountable to the people of this nation. I commend the gentleman for a move toward transparency and accountability. Yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time we have?
Gentleman from Maryland has 6 1/2 minutes remaining. Gentleman from California has 9 1/4 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 459, which passed out of the Oversight Committee without even a single hearing and without testimony from any Federal Reserve officials. Let me be clear, the Government Accountability Office has had the authority to audit the Federal Reserve's books for 3 decades. In 2010, the Dodd-Frank Act expanded the types of audits GAO conducts of the Federal Reserve, as well as the data the Fed must disclose to the public. For example, Dodd-Frank required GAO to audit the emergency financial assistance provided during the financial crisis. The Act also opens discount window operations and open market operations to audit so GAO can assess their operational integrity, collateral policies, fairness, and the use of third-party contractors. And Dodd-Frank requires the Federal Reserve to release information regarding borrowers and counterparties participating in discount lending programs and open market operations. Mr. Speaker, as a conferee who helped craft the final Dodd-Frank legislation, I supported all of these provisions. I believe other areas of the Federal Reserve's operations are also ripe for audit. During the committee's consideration of this legislation, I offered an amendment that would require GAO to perform an audit of the independent foreclosure reviews currently being conducted by the Federal Reserve in the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. 14 mortgage servicers have been required to establish a process under which borrowers can request an independent review of their loan histories. But at the end of May, only 200,000 out of 4.4 million eligible borrowers have requested an independent review of their foreclosure cases. We need to understand whether the design of the program has limited the number of borrowers who have sought reviews of their cases. Further, it is unclear how the types and amounts of remediation are being determined. This is precisely the type of issue that should be reviewed by the GAO. Certainly, the public has a right and the Congress has a responsibility to know and understand the transactions and enforcement actions undertaken by the nation's central bank. However, when Congress established the Fed in 1913, it understood that independence from political interference was critical to the bank's ability to fulfill its monetary policy responsibilities. The Dodd-Frank Act was carefully crafted to expand transparency while preserving the protections that ensure the independence of the Federal Reserve's internal deliberations on monetary policy matters. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve must be able to pursue the policies it considers most responsive to our nation's current economic conditions and most likely to fulfill its dual mandate of promoting maximum employment and stable prices. We should not allow GAO examinations to be the back door through which politics intrudes on monetary policy, which is what this legislation would allow. Opening the Federal Reserve's internal policy deliberations to GAO review would influence how such deliberations are conducted and potentially the policies that are chosen, thus degrading the Fed's independence. Last week, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Bernanke, described the potential impact of this bill to the Financial Services Committee, and he said, and I quote, "The nightmare scenario I have is one in which some future Fed chairman would decide and say to raise the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. And somebody would say, I don't like that decision. I want the GAO to go in and get all the records, get all the transcripts, get all the preparatory materials, and give us an independent opinion whether or not that was the right decision." I share Chairman Bernanke's concern. For that reason, during the markup of this legislation in the Oversight Committee, I offered an amendment that would have retained the protections for the Board of Governors' internal monetary policy deliberations to ensure that the audit required by this legislation did not intrude on the Federal Reserve's independence. I continue to believe this revision is needed to ensure this bill does not inhibit the ability of the Federal Reserve to implement monetary policies to strengthen our nation's economy, as it has done repeatedly throughout the recent financial crisis.
Gentleman reserve his time?
Yes.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
Can I inquire how much time we both have remaining, please?
Gentleman from California has 9 1/4 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Maryland has 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Kansas, Ms. Jenkins.
Gentlelady from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank Dr. Paul for his leadership on this very important issue. Mr. Speaker, the Federal Reserve lent out $16 trillion during the fiscal crisis. That's larger than the entire U.S. economy, or worse, our federal debt. Trillions of taxpayer dollars, and we have very little understanding of where it went. Congress holds the purse, but we have no oversight over how the Fed manages the funds. This is why I've co-sponsored a bipartisan effort to audit the Fed in full. It's our responsibility. Current monetary policy audits of the Fed are insufficient. Most Fed operations consist of transactions with foreign central banks, and yet they are exempt from review. When corruption is suspected, a common refrain is follow the money. With a historic sovereign debt crisis brewing in Europe, we must look closely at our own balance sheet. We must follow the money. As a CPA, I know we need more transparency in Washington. It should start with the Federal Reserve. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
I yield to Mr. Kucinich 1 minute.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of this debate an article about the Fed's policy model sacrifices its maximum employment mandate and targets 5 to 6% as unemployment.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of this debate an article from Bloomberg News that talks about how secret Fed loans gave banks billions that were undisclosed to Congress.
Without objection.
This is all about disclosure and accountability. You know, the Fed's not some kind of hocus-pocus black box operation. The Fed essentially supplants the constitutional mandate in Article 1, Section 8 that belongs to the Congress of the United States. Let's look at some recent history here. 2008, subprime meltdown, collateralized debt obligations, go back to mortgage-backed securities, neighborhoods in Cleveland melting down, people losing their homes. The Fed looked the other way, and we're saying, oh, don't go into the Fed. It'll be political. Yes, it's political. We have unemployment because of politics. We have people losing their homes because of politics. We have banks getting uncalculated amounts of money from the Federal Reserve, and we don't even know about it. Meanwhile, people can't get a loan to keep their home or keep their business. Audit the Fed? You bet we should audit the Fed. We have to have accountability. It's time the Congress stood up for its constitutional role. Article 1, Section 8, power to coin or create money. It's time that we stood up for America's 99%. It's time that we stood up to the Federal Reserve that right now acts like it's some kind of high exalted priesthood, unaccountable in a democracy. Let's change that by voting for the Paul bill. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
At this time, yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Loomis.
Gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, before the financial crisis, the Fed's lending to the financial system was minimal, and monetary policy was limited. But since 2008, they've tripled their balance sheet and transacted nearly $16 trillion in loans. Clearly, Congress has delegated monetary policy to the Fed, and I, for one, am not advocating that we abolish the Fed. But Congress retained oversight responsibility, and Congress should insist on an accurate accounting of the Fed so members of Congress can better understand monetary policy. Our colleague Ron Paul was instrumental in getting an audit of the Fed's emergency activities during the financial crisis, but restrictions remain in place on examining monetary policy actions such as quantitative easing and assisting failing banks in Europe. When the Fed's cumulative lending hits the size and scope to be greater than the entire GDP of the United States, it's past time for Congress to insist on transparency. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Does the gentleman from Maryland continue to reserve?
We continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
I yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it appears as though we agree on certain things. We agree that some transparency is required. We certainly agree on a bipartisan basis that what the GAO did under Dodd-Frank, at a minimum, was a good thing. I think there's no question, my colleague who was here earlier, Mr. Frank, certainly would agree to the numbers, the expansion of the Fed in that period that Ms. Loomis talked about between 2008 and now. I think we would all agree the Federal Reserve is the people's bank. It is broadly owned by 316 or 320 million Americans. I served on the board of a public company, one that I founded. I understand that if you have more than 500 stockholders, you have an obligation to considerable disclosure. Although the Fed is audited to see whether basically some numbers are correct or not on a limited basis, the truth is the Federal Reserve is not open and transparent, not even years after they make decisions. I think the American people have a piercing question right now, one that is not the question that Dr. Paul was asking when he first wanted to audit the Fed. The question is, will we be like Greece? Will we be like Germany? Will we be like the trauma that's sweeping over the European Union? Do we in fact know the true numbers? Do we know the extent of the leverage and the policies and the accuracy and the knowledge of the Federal Reserve? I think calmly we have to ask that question. Do we know what we need to know, or are we willing to not know in hopes that we won't be political because we don't know? Now, I've been in Congress for 12 full years at the end of this term, and I've learned one thing. Congress has a tendency to do two things well: nothing at all and overreact. I trust today will be a day in which we're in between. I yield myself an additional minute.
Gentleman is recognized.
We would do something so that we would know more a year from now than we know today. We would not overreact. We would not want to stifle what the Fed has done historically without an awful lot more study. Changes to an entity like the central bank should be done thoughtfully and over time. My friend Dr. Paul would like to do more than this bill does. But this minimal effort offered on a bipartisan basis is offered today because we believe the American people have a right to know, an interest to know, and a need to know. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Maryland.
I yield the gentleman, Mr. Clay, 1 minute.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 459. This bill directs the Comptroller General to conduct an audit of the Federal Reserve. Since 1982, the GAO has had authority to audit the Federal Reserve Board and banks subject to exception for monetary policy-related decisions and activities. In 2009, Congress provided authority for the GAO to audit actions by the Fed under Section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act to lend to any single and specific partnership or corporation, notwithstanding the generally applicable monetary policy-related exceptions. In 2010, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act added new audit authorities. In addition, GAO has conducted a number of other reviews of Federal Reserve activities, but we need a full audit, and I urge my colleagues to vote for the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire on how much time is available?
Gentleman from California has 4 1/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Maryland has all of his time has expired.
And with that, I'll close. Mr. Speaker, I won't use all of our time. Slightly different opinion than the ranking members. I believe regular order has been followed on this bill and followed and then some. This is something that Dr. Paul has worked on a bipartisan basis with Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, with Republican Congresses and Democratic Congresses. The support for this, as you saw here today, goes to Republicans and Democrats, progressives, conservatives, blue dogs. The American people want to know. I don't believe the American people are afraid to know. Of course, the American people would not be comfortable with interference with the Fed, with micromanaging policy decisions, with tearing down the institution. But in fact, I think that the 9/11 of the financial market, if you will, the meltdown in 2008 and 2009, $1 trillion nearly in TARP money, and countless trillions in expansion of the balance sheet have taught us one thing: what we don't know can hurt us. Now, before 9/11 of the financial market, before the meltdown, before the Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns evaporated, we would have thought, well, there's some very smart people on Wall Street, and we'd have been right. But smart people can be wrong. We put very good people on the Federal Reserve Board. We choose very good chairmen. Chairman Bernanke was a choice of Republicans and Democrats alike. But ultimately, looking over the shoulder by Congress, by my committee, by the Financial Services Committee, just to ask the question, are those numbers undeniable truths brought down on tablets, or are they in fact open to second guessing after the fact, questioning of whether or not a model works, or whether there is just a small but meaningful opportunity for tens of trillions of dollars to fall on the backs of the American people if they got it wrong? That's the question the American people asked. And after 2008, it's a question Congress must ask. When Chairman Franks voted for Ron Paul's bill, perhaps he didn't want it, but he voted for it, as did countless Democrats. Ultimately, it was reduced, but not eliminated in conference. There was some recognition that needed to be audit. Today, what we're doing is asking to send to the Senate a piece of legislation that more purely and clearly says, I believe the American people have a right to know. Perhaps the Senate will take up a slightly different version. Perhaps it'll be truly a one-time audit. Perhaps it'll be limited. But the American people need to hold us in the House and our counterparts in the Senate responsible that we do know what we need to know, and that we will never again say we rely on other people to be so smart that we shouldn't look over their shoulder. That's not what the America that I grew up in. It's not the clear and transparent America the American people are asking for. And with that, I urge passage of this bipartisan bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 459 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative. Gentleman from Maryland.
That's a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
That is correct.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 4157.
Does the gentleman call the bill as amended?
Yes.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4157, a bill to prohibit the Secretary of Labor from finalizing a proposed rule under the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 related